Great. I see quite a few of you have joined and introduced yourself. Thank you again for joining us for this webinar on advocating for more localized and feminist humanitarian action. My name is Anjali Rohn, and I'm the Senior Associate for Humanitarian Communications at Women Deliver, and I'll be guiding you through this presentation. Just as a reminder, this is a webinar designed for grassroots civil society organizations to share and learn from each other about best practices for advocating on a global stage around issues tied to localization and gender-sensitive humanitarian action. We know that many of you are also joining from international organizations and INGOs, and we are certainly happy to have you, and we hope that this can also be informative in terms of how to support your allies and partners in local settings. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Marcy Hirsch, the Senior Manager of Humanitarian Advocacy at Women Deliver, to provide some scene-setting remarks and introduce us to this webinar. Go ahead, Marcy.
Thank you so much, Anjali. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. It's really a pleasure and really an honor to see so many names joining us today. I know that there are so many webinars happening right now. There are so many new and challenging demands on everyone's time. So I'm really honored by everyone's participation today. I promise that we are going to do our best to make this time commitment worth your while. I also want to note that this webinar was created as part of a partnership that Women Deliver has with a group called the NEAR Network. If you're not familiar with the NEAR Network, it's a movement of civil society organizations from the Global South who all share a common vision of promoting fair, equitable, and dignified partnerships in the humanitarian sector. The partnership that Women Deliver has with NEAR is focused on adding a gender lens to their very essential work. And so I'd like to extend a very special welcome to all of the members of the NEAR Network who are with us today. But indeed, welcome to everyone. I think everyone on the call likely knows a little bit about Women Deliver, but just in case, very, very briefly, Women Deliver is a global advocacy organization. We're based in New York and champion gender equality and the health and rights of girls and women around the world. The team that I manage that has organized this incredible webinar today is focused specifically on the health and rights of girls and women living in crisis settings. We work to elevate the voices of girls and women and the organizations that they lead to ensure that they have a seat at decision-making tables in the humanitarian space. And we also push on the humanitarian sector as a whole to deliver strong responses for girls and women. You can go to the next slide, Anjali. So today we're going to be sharing best practices for advocating for localized feminist and humanitarian action. But before we get into the how, it's important that we're all on the same page and make sure that we all know why that's so important. I think we can all agree that civil society organizations are among the best positioned to meet the needs of girls and women in emergencies, but they often lack the necessary support to maximize impact. We wrote a report that you can see an image of the cover on your screen that was released at the end of last year based on a number of consultations that we had with organizations from all over the world last year. And that report shines a light on the challenges that women-focused organizations face in accessing the humanitarian sector, but we also focus on the promising solutions that we hope will serve as North Stars to guide us all in working to do this better. So I encourage you to take a look at that report if you haven't seen it yet. But I'll just highlight a number of the key points that are there as a little cheat sheet for today. So the first is the finding that women-focused civil society organizations have limited access to funding. So the official figure that we work with is that less than 9% of global and humanitarian funding goes directly to local actors, but even less of that goes to women-focused organizations. And in fact, we don't have the figure of how much specifically goes to women-focused organizations. Many of you probably know that phrase, that you measure what you treasure. The fact that we're not even counting how much money goes to women-focused organizations in humanitarian response demonstrates that this is not something that is currently prioritized by the humanitarians. Second, limited coordination between local and international actors. We see this all the time, that there are so many roadblocks that hinder information sharing between local organizations and those who who have more power in humanitarian responses, whether it's the language of coordination meetings, the location of them, the acronyms that are used. These are not spaces that are designed for everyone to engage equally. You can go to the next slide. Third, capacity building generally favors international agendas over civil society organizations' priorities. What we hear from our colleagues and partner organizations is that trainings are often conducted in a one-off manner, generally for the purpose of implementing a program designed by an international organization. And that training is infrequently in line with the long-term goals of a civil society organization partner. Next, insufficient accountability to civil society organizations. There are limited feedback mechanisms in place in global policies and in global programming designed for humanitarian responses. And too often, these instruments leave women-focused CSOs out entirely from those processes. And this includes some of the most important policy instruments that we have that are guiding our sector's work. Last but not least, of course, the lack of meaningful engagement in humanitarian decision-making. Too frequently, we see that the way that women-focused organizations are asked to engage in policy fora is in a tokenistic manner that fails to truly value the important, I would say, essential contributions that they have to make. So I'll stop there. I hope that that's a good primer to explain why we need to have this this webinar today to try to push beyond this and give everyone on the webinar some tools to help be a part of that change we need to see. So I'll now pass it back to Anjali, and I really look forward to this discussion together this morning or this evening, wherever you are. Take care.
Thanks so much, Marcy, for setting the stage by explaining our how, our why, and our what we mean when we're talking about feminist and localized aid. And we look forward to connecting with our other speakers throughout this presentation to talk about how to most effectively advocate for these issues in global spaces. So we are joined by Christina Mader, who is the Senior Program and Research Manager for the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. In her role, she oversees the NGO Working Group's fellowship program, their feminist monitoring and analysis efforts, and the production of annual policy briefs, and has supported and trained a number of advocates to speak at global policy arenas, including the UN Security Council. So she'll be sharing her perspective a little later on messages that resonate best for international audiences, and also having a frank conversation on which messages sometimes fall flat. We're also joined by Diana Abu Abbas, the Executive Director of Marsa Sexual Health Center in Lebanon, which is a feminist NGO that provides safe and non-discriminatory access to sexual and reproductive health services to everyone who walks through their doors. Diana is a feminist advocate that has spoken at a range of international convenings, including the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the Women Deliver Conference, and so many more. And we'll be sharing a little bit about her process and her guidance as well. So thank you both so much for joining. This webinar, as I mentioned before, is designed for grassroots civil society organizations to share and learn tips of how to make the most of international advocacy opportunities where we can push for issues around gender-sensitive localization that Marcy outlined. So we'll be talking a lot about how to craft messages and stories that resonate and really convince policymakers. We acknowledge, however, that during this current moment, during COVID-19, travel to speak at international convenings is limited. So we will also talk about tactics about how to re-strategize our collective advocacy in this environment. To that end, our webinar will be divided into two sections. First, we'll be talking about how to advocate at international convenings when speaking opportunities are present. And then we'll be talking about what that looks like now at a time of COVID-19 when travel is limited. We'll have a Q&A after each section, so please do have your questions, your comments ready. And if you have any burning questions, feel free to type those in the chat box and we'll address them as soon as they come up. So let's go ahead and get started. In this first part of the webinar, we'll be discussing best practices for civil society organizations to navigate international advocacy opportunities and make the greatest impact. We'll be talking mostly here about speaking opportunities, like for example, when you're invited to speak at a global conference, meeting, or event. As many of you already know, a lot of this work to ensure that you're meaningfully engaged at speaking opportunities actually starts before you travel. It is the responsibility, as we know, of international actors to ensure that you have the logistical and financial support you need to travel to global meetings. But here are some questions you can ask if you don't think you're receiving the support you need, and to advocate for more meaningful engagement. So you should clarify how long it'll take to get your visa and really urge organizers to build in this time into conference planning. It is not acceptable to receive an invitation too late to receive a visa with too short of a time frame for you to get prepared to travel abroad. Of course, asking for meeting sponsorship letters for visa purposes. You can also ask the NGO sponsoring you if they can support with in-country travel costs. As many CSO representatives know, it can be quite costly to travel within your own country to go to embassies to obtain a visa. So this is also something you can advocate for. Of course, ask who to speak to for any visa-related questions. And those who are traveling who have childcare responsibilities, are pregnant or breastfeeding, do ask about childcare options, breastfeeding spaces in the conference space that you'll be attending. As you know, all of these questions are important because advocating for more feminist and localized humanitarian action isn't just about pushing for more funding, meaningful engagement, which are certainly part of the picture, but it's also about transforming the humanitarian system to be more inclusive of your voices. So really consider this pre-departure phase part of your advocacy as well. Your needs to travel are likely similar to many other CSOs around the world. So advocating and communicating these to meeting organizers is actually a part of pushing for a more feminist and localized approach to humanitarian action in and of itself. Another way to advocate is before you arrive is for pushing for organizers of international speaking opportunities to ensure that the opportunity is framed in the most meaningful way possible. Again, this is really the responsibility of international actors to ensure that your voices are not tokenized. But here are a few signs for you to look out for so you can play an active role in promoting you and your colleagues' meaningful engagement. Some considerations and some questions to ask. Does the speaking opportunity really allow you to share your expertise, experience, proposed solution, or is it only asking you to share one element of your story or experience, most often tied to suffering, contextualizing an issue, but not really drawing on your full expertise on the situation? Similarly, are you invited to share a story as part of a campaign or product that you helped create or produce, or something that you didn't help shape? There are many situations where organizations unfortunately are launching reports on a given issue, and CSOs who are never involved in the report's creation are invited to those launch events to share their story. This, as we know, tokenizes and takes advantage of your experience rather than integrates it into decision-making processes themselves. Other questions to ask yourself about the opportunity so you can advocate for the most meaningful engagement possible. Are you able to shape your contributions freely, or is the organizer imposing a strict expectation of what you must say and include at the outset? Will there be transparency about how your story and contributions will be implemented and acted upon? These are important questions to raise with the organizer so you know the influence that you have at any given speaking opportunity abroad. Do you have an opportunity to contribute to the overall agenda setting of the event? We know that sometimes this is not always possible, especially in events with predetermined formats such as at the Security Council, but it's important for CSOs to be given the chance to have a say in the overall agenda of the event or campaign and not just your individual piece, if those opportunities do exist. And finally, will you have equal access to other opportunities available to all other participants? For example, if other panelists have received opportunities to set up private meetings with decision makers and other key stakeholders, and those are of interest of you as well, make sure to advocate for those. Note that if you run into an opportunity that doesn't meet all of these criteria for meaningful engagement, or it ticks off some of the boxes under tokenistic engagement, it doesn't mean you need to dismiss the opportunity altogether. But what you should do is advocate to organizers to try to push them to ensure meaningful engagement of you or your colleagues' voices. So, for example, if the organizers are only looking for a CSO representative to talk about the suffering you've seen or the issues that you have faced, perhaps propose an alternative format where you can talk about your experience, but also your expertise and the solutions you'd like to see and your community would like to see put forward. It's so important to set this strong foundation for meaningful advocacy at the outset, because by doing so, you are indeed pushing for more localized and feminist humanitarian action before you even walk up on that stage or that podium. So now that we've discussed a little bit about how you can advocate before you even arrive at an international speaking opportunity, I'll turn it over to Christina to discuss how you can continue this advocacy once you arrive and what messages can resonate most. Over to you, Christina.
Great, thank you so much. Hi everyone, just by way of quick introduction, I'm Christina Mader. I'm with the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. The NGO Working Group is a consensus-driven coalition of 17 international NGOs based in New York. I've been with the working group for over 10 years, and over the last 5 years or so, the working group has supported dozens of women leaders in their advocacy efforts at both formal and informal meetings, specifically of the UN Security Council. So based on this experience, wanted to share some good practice on different ways to leverage opportunities to engage directly with decision makers while also being authentic and reflecting feminist perspective in those opportunities. So the first kind of overarching piece of good practice is to really think strategically about what will cut through the noise and fill gaps in the existing knowledge of decision makers. So this means using a feminist lens to localize your issue for policymakers and illuminate what they're missing in their understanding of the situation. So what are the gender dimensions that are driving the conflict which are overlooked? What is the invisible to the international community role that women's groups are playing at the local level? So you want to kind of consider the picture, the gender blind picture that policymakers have when considering a specific crisis. And it will be very high level, political in nature. And so you should consider the speaking opportunity as a way of translating for them using a feminist lens, the reality of the situation at the local level. Another just point of good practice to share is we often find tension between sharing personal stories and narratives and focusing on issues in the work of the organization. As Anjali mentioned, it's often that policymakers want to hear the perspective of a refugee woman. And so we really push back on that tokenistic representation of women's voices. And we've found that, to the extent to which you're comfortable, leveraging a personal story as an example of a broader patterns or trends. Policymakers can be persuaded by personal stories and narratives, particularly when they highlight, a dimension that's unseen. But we really, we always want to avoid policymakers over focusing on one individual story as solely representative of all women's experiences, and also making, of course, any speaker uncomfortable or feel like they're solely there just because of that experience and not their expertise. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't share your story, it just means thinking and working with the organizers of the event or whatever international NGO you might be partnering with to really craft and think strategically about how to share the story. Something else that we really try to do as the working group is challenging the desire of policymakers to cut through the noise using shocking stories or graphic, detailed accounts of violence. You know, from what I've seen is there's a certain amount of desensitization amongst policymakers, and so the result is that those stories don't usually work in eliciting the type of action we seek. Instead, what we find is that those stories will be used by policymakers to make a political point, but they won't change their behavior. And so that's something we really do seek to avoid. And we often find that specific examples or detailed accounts are better suited for maybe not public speaking opportunities, but one-on-one conversations where you go into more detail. The other thing that's just really, really important and should probably take up the bulk of any kind of messages or statement or briefing that's given is recommendations. You really want to focus on recommendations that are targeted and specific. They should be geared towards the fora you're talking to, and keeping them as focused and prioritized as possible. So, the top 3 recommendations you might have. It can be really tempting as someone who tends to write a lot to have, your top 20 recommendations that you want to share, but trying to focus on the top 3 most important things, and from your perspective, and in the context of the committee or the organization you're speaking to. It can be, really, avoiding the urge to provide background information and historical context is something that we struggle with a lot, because often the dominant narrative for policymakers is a very desensitized, very top-line understanding of a conflict that doesn't really reflect the actual dynamics or lived experiences of the women we're working with. So we push back against that desire to kind of correct the record to a certain extent and really try to focus on next steps in action as much as possible in the more public speaking opportunities, while saving kind of that information for one-on-one meetings or other kind of speaking events. We also really try to ground and recommend grounding your advocacy in data and evidence, including but particularly information collected from the local level. Data is really one of your most valuable tools. And if you think about what data or statistics are being heard at the international level, it is usually from governments or UN agencies, and it is often and mostly gender blind. So highlighting data and research collected by civil society or academic institutions within your community is immensely valuable. That information just isn't reaching international policymakers. It might be information that's well known within your community, but I guarantee it is not well known at the international level. So that is something we really work to emphasize. And there's so many instances in working with our partners over the last few years where they do have access to this rich data and illustrative examples and information that we just had no idea even existed, because it was in a different language we didn't have access to. And so that's just something I really emphasize as a good practice. Something else just to share is, keeping your advocacy message clear and focused, but it doesn't have to be simplistic. I think, already sort of mentioned this, that the way policymakers discuss issues at the international level is often overly simplistic to the point that nuance is lost. So your intervention is a way of adding nuance and detail so policymakers understand the gender-specific dynamics. So that means finding a way to balance the amount of detail you provide and add detail and nuance to recommendations rather than kind of the background. And then, really importantly, you want to obviously speak to your expertise. So, you want to be able to essentially answer any follow-up question to anything you talk about in your statement or briefing. So you don't want to leave anything out you can't answer follow-ups about, but rely on your expertise, because your knowledge is what's missing from the policymaker's understanding of the issue or situation. Another, good practice kind of tip is, consider the audience, the focus of the meeting or event, and your advocacy goals in shaping your message. Is the audience going to be comprised of senior diplomats, or is it going to be country-specific policy experts? That really does make a difference in how you shape your message or your recommendations. One specific example is in terms of funding. So funding is something all NGOs need. However, policymakers we're often engaging with are rarely the ones that directly control funding. So what we've found to be really effective is highlighting really clearly and using data and examples of ways that lack of funding for women's rights NGOs is really having a direct negative impact on women's rights, or preventing women from accessing essential services, especially in frontline humanitarian crises, etc. So we found that to be a really effective way of talking about funding, and then versus direct needs for funding in kind of international speaking opportunities. Another kind of message just to share is, as someone who works for a coalition, obviously I believe strongly in coalitions and the power of networks, and we've seen it can be really effective when individuals who are invited do work ahead of time in reaching out to partners or other networks, in gathering thoughts or ideas for how to shape or craft their message. It can be really powerful when someone says they're speaking on behalf of not just their organization, but a number of other ones. This is obviously something to balance with being able to speak from your expertise. So you don't want to be bringing in issues that you have no background in talking on, but it can be powerful to kind of, if you're able to navigate that, speak on behalf of the network. So a point on preparation just to share is, so we really encourage our partners to prepare for international advocacy by undertaking strategic research, including by connecting with us. Knowledge really is power in international advocacy, and so you already have knowledge and expertise of your own work, but developing knowledge and understanding of the dynamics of the space you'll be engaging in will be immensely valuable. And understanding the perspectives and the dynamics and kind of how they view the situation will help you understand how to counter kind of their perspective, and also understand and anticipate what questions they might ask. So I think this came up earlier in the introduction. Something that we see a lot in meetings is policymakers asking NGO colleagues, is this program effective in the field? And oftentimes our partners don't work with that program, which is a point unto itself, an advocacy point to itself. So, but understanding and anticipating what questions they might have, and using that as an opportunity to kind of flip it and be able to make your advocacy point, and make a broader point maybe of why you don't engage with that program. It could be just because they're in a completely different part of the country and there's no reason you would engage with them. But it also might be because there's challenges related to that program, and it allows you that entry point for making that point. And it also allows you an entry point to talk about what complementary or alternative civil society efforts in that same area are being carried out. So one additional point, just to make, this could be the subject of a webinar into itself, but is related to safety. So over the last few years, as the working group has, worked to develop security and safety protocols in partnership with our civil society partners at the local level to ensure, there's a clear understanding on all sides regarding potential risks. And so that should always be something that's a conversation before any public speaking opportunity. I won't go into detail, but I just wanted to flag that as a really, really important part of the preparation and also the follow-up process. There should be really clear follow-up afterwards and communication between local partners and international NGOs or UN entities regarding kind of the safety and security of any panelists. And so the very last point I wanted to make was just to treat any experience to speak in a public fora as the first of multiple opportunities. So in our experience, effective advocates who are strategic and targeted will see doors open for future advocacy opportunities. So it can be really tempting to kind of pour everything into a statement or briefing. However, the more focused and targeted you are, the more valuable the information you share with policymakers will be, and the more likely you are to have future opportunities to engage in. And that engagement might not happen in the same way. It might be bilateral meetings instead of a large conference or an event, but it will undoubtedly happen. And so taking the pressure off of yourself to that this is the only chance you'll have to make the point will allow you to kind of be more focused and targeted and effective in your advocacy. That's all I have on my end. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share our experiences, and I really look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. I think there's a lot of food for thought here that we can continue to unpack a little later in our discussion. But right now, I will turn it to Diana Abu Abbas to share her own tips for advocating effectively in international spaces. Over to you, Diana.
Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anjali and Women Deliver for this opportunity. As the director of Malta Sexual Health Center in Beirut, Lebanon, I've been asked to be on different international conferences and platforms. And today I will be sharing with you some of the steps I use to prepare for my presentations and for my speeches. And hopefully this information will be helpful to you as well. We're going to begin with the next slide with a few questions that we're going to ask ourselves once we start preparing for our speech or our presentation. The first question is, what is the event we're attending? What kind of setting is it going to be? As you see in these two photos, the first one is a formal event. It was, both of them are organized by Women Deliver. The first one was a panel at the CSW last year. It was a side event. And the next one is more of an informal session. And the first one, you see everybody, all the speakers are on the panel. They're sitting at a bit of a higher level than the audience. While in the next one, it's more intimate. They are sitting on the same level as the speakers. Some people are sitting on the floor, so they're completely different. You need to consider what kind of setting is it going to be. And also ask yourself the question, will I need to have any visual aid, any sort of media? Do I need a video? Am I going to use photos? Do I need to prepare a PowerPoint presentation? And also consider what is the purpose of this event. Next slide, please. The next question we're going to ask ourselves in the preparation is, who is attending? Who is going to be the audience? Are they going to be beneficiaries from your organization, or are they going to be prospective donors that you want to impress with your presentation or your speech so that you can apply for a grant from their foundation? Are they people you know, or are they young people, for example? Next, please. Then you have to ask yourself, why me? What's my relationship to the topic? Why have I been invited? For example, I get invited to panels and conferences that are related to sexual and reproductive health. We know that Tarana Burke, who is the founder of the Me Too movement, she was working on GBV, and she is a leader in her community, and she goes on to a lot of public speaking opportunities. It could be something as simple as your old high school inviting you to speak to inspire the younger students. Next, please. We also need to ask ourselves, what are the messages I want to convey? Here I put in a template as a starting point. If you don't know where to start, for example, you can think of this sentence to fill the blanks so that it guides you through your preparation process. As a message, I want to say, because of lack of facilities, women in remote areas don't have access to sexual and reproductive health services. So we need to decentralize care through funding from the Ministry of Public Health. This is a guideline for you that you can use as a starting point. Next. Now we're going to move to the preparation of the talking points. First of all, you need to ask the organizers, how much time are you allocated? If you have 1 minute, 2, or 15, you need to make sure that you do not pass this time limit, because otherwise you will be taking the time from other people and you'll be overstepping on the program. So you need to be very careful. First of all, start by doing an outline of what you're going to say. You can use bullet points before you start developing your ideas further. You can also use examples from your experience, because this is where the richness of your expertise happens. And you can also use statistics that leave an impact with the audience. For example, if you have 4,000 women in a rural community that you needed to give services to, and you were able to reach 50% of those women, that means it's 2,000, and that's a huge number that you can share and that can show your success in your initiative. And usually in these kinds of events, they always ask you at the end, if we could take away one message from what you're saying today that we would remember, what is this message? So always be prepared to have a small sentence that summarizes your ask or what you're here for. Next. Now we're moving to the how, the delivery of the speech that we're going to have. This photo that you see is taken from the Solidays Festival in Paris. Solidays is a fundraising festival for HIV. All the profit that they get from the ticket sale goes to organizations in France and around the world working to fight HIV. I was invited as a representative from one of these organizations, and I was in front of an audience of 35,000 people. So I had to find a way for me to engage this audience with me, because they didn't want to listen to what I had to say. They were waiting for their favorite band to come on. So the first question I asked them was, imagine if somebody banned you from coming to Solidays. And everybody booed because they didn't want to imagine that somebody would stop them from coming to the festival. And then I asked them, I went more personal, imagine if somebody stopped you from loving the person you love. And everybody booed again. And here they were interested, like, what is this person saying? And this is where I was allowed to share my story, and they were interested to listen to what I had to say. And I spoke about being an LGBT activist and the crackdown from the government in 2017 on LGBT organizations in Lebanon. If you look at my outfit, I'm wearing a very casual outfit because it's a festival in Paris in the summer. I want the audience to relate to me through what I'm wearing. I'm wearing shorts and a t-shirt, but my t-shirt says a lot. It says HIV positive, and the print is in rainbow. So immediately I'm presenting myself through my clothing as an LGBT activist and somebody who also fights against HIV. You can also use your intonation in your delivery, because do you want to talk about your passion for the work that you do, or do you want to use a more calm and soothing voice so that you gain empathy from the audience? So you see, the way I change my voice helps a lot. Next, please. Now we're going to move to practice. Once you set your outline and you know your time frame and you develop your ideas and what you're going to say, you need to practice. You can either read it and keep repeating it until you get it right. You can record yourself and see if you overstep the time limit and how you're speaking. If you're going to say every now and then, it'll catch your attention and you will stop yourself from doing it. You can also practice with a friend and get their objective advice, or use a mirror to see, for example, how you're using your body language, if you're moving around a lot in your presentation. On the left, you can see the cat in the photos, and this is how I'm suggesting you begin like a cat, and then you move on with the confidence to become a tiger. This in no way is an underestimation of cats, of course. But it just helps you. The more you practice, the more you're confident. And while you're repeating, always make sure that you memorize the message you want to say. If you memorize it word for word, sometimes you're going to forget. It happened to me in Paris. The moment I was about to go on stage, I felt that I forgot everything. But then it comes back to you because you've repeated. And if you find yourself feeling nervous, do some breathing exercises so that you find yourself a bit more relaxed. Next. So now we move on to the post-event networking. If you're going to this event, always make sure that you research who your audience is. If you have a donor, for example, that you're interested in working in, do your research about the organization and always go prepared. Think of this donor as your crush, and you're going on your first date to meet this crush. So always, after the event, The people you want to meet, make sure that you meet them, you talk to them, have your business card ready with your name and contact. If you're not affiliated with an organization, create your own and print it. It can be very cheap. Also, when you're approaching this donor, be charismatic, be calm, be clear in the way that you're speaking. Have a pitch for 1 minute ready about the work you do and how important it is. And just like on a first date, always leave them wanting more. Don't speak too much to them, get their contact. Once you get back after the event to your hotel or you're back home, even if you're feeling tired, you're feeling jet lagged, make sure that you send them an email, send them a video or a report about the organization, and tell them looking forward to receive your feedback, because this is how you establish a bit of a connection with them, and you're also setting up to your second date with them. Next slide, please. So now to recap briefly, we're going to think about what is the event we're going to, who is going to be my audience, why are they inviting me. I'm going to develop my simplified message, why I'm going to speak at this event. I'm going to develop my outline and ask about the time frame that I have. Then I will develop my presentation and decide on my delivery style, what I'm going to wear. Then I'm going to practice and repeat, use of friends so that they give me objective advice. I'm going to record myself, and then I'm going to network at this event and be prepared with my business card and have my pitch ready so that I know how to relay the information in a concise manner. And I'm going to email them back and look forward to have their feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana, and to Christina for sharing your lessons, your perspectives, your expertise. Here's just a high-level recap of some of the best practices we heard from the two presenters, and some more from Women Delivers experience. First, as both Diana and Christina mentioned, open with concrete stories and examples from your experience to set the scene, and try to make these broad, move from narrow to broad to show how the top-down patriarchal structure of the humanitarian system directly affects your work and the community that you work in. Use global data and evidence to show the scale of the problem, and then practice solutions-oriented advocacy. Propose concrete solutions, and don't just focus on the problems throughout the course of your speech or your presentation. One way to do that is to highlight something people in the room can do now, and one thing that they can do in the long term to drive these solutions. And in all of these messages, just like Diana said, make sure you identify the specific target that you're speaking to, know who your advocacy message is directed to, and call on them to act. Here's a template that you can use to craft your advocacy speech, very similar to what Diana shared. No matter where you're speaking or what you're speaking about, we often find that speeches that have the strongest impact and influence have these 4 key components that you see up on the screen in a matrix. They highlight the problem using data and evidence. They describe why it matters and broader implications. They talk about solutions, and then they talk about what needs to happen to drive these solutions, again, specifying the target in terms of who can take this forward. So here is an example of how to use this template for advocating for more localized and feminist humanitarian funding specifically. So under the problem, you can talk about a program that was able to thrive with adequate funding, or like Christina said, one that failed or didn't achieve the impact that you desired because it didn't have enough. Also talk about why it matters. Describe the broader implication of this problem around inadequate or unstrategic funding to local civil society organizations, including those focused on women. Highlight why women-focused CSOs should be funded in the first place, why that is so important, and how it impedes humanitarian responses when they aren't. Then you can move on to the solutions section, and you know the solutions best. You can highlight commitments made through the grand bargain and other global commitments, and call for an increase of more strategic funding for women-focused CSOs. And like Christina said, you don't need to lose the nuance in your advocacy. You can call for the specific types of funding, whether that's long-term funding, flexible funding, certain financial mechanisms that are important for you to be able to access access funding in your context, those nuances add new detail to the conversation and really matter. And it's where you can highlight specific solutions that you need. And then close with a powerful statement about what needs to happen. You can add, like I said, a message on what needs to happen now. So perhaps you can ask the international organizations and INGOs in the room to assess whether their local partners, right after the presentation, they can assess whether their local partners are receiving the type of funding they need to maximize their impact, and then call for a commitment that people in the room can make in the long term. So push for international decision makers to ensure that, for example, at least 50% of funding goes to local CSOs, including those focused on women. I also have an example here on how you can use this advocacy template when calling for more meaningful engagement of CSOs in decision making. We'll skip this for the sake of time, but we will keep it here for you to refer to after. And these are just templates that you can refer to, add your own stories and experiences and solutions, and bring them to light even more. Before we wrap this section up and open it up to you for our discussion, I just wanted to share a few data sources we can use to supplement your advocacy messages. As both Diana and Christina mentioned, data is so important, so just wanted to share a few sources. The first is the Financial Tracking Service, which for many countries includes data on the percentage of localized aid that exists in that country. So it's a key point that you can highlight throughout your advocacy speeches and presentations. Instructions for how to access and use the Financial Tracking Service database is on this slide. It requires a few steps just to take you to the right place to see the percentage of localized aid in your country, but it's a great tool when you do find it. Unfortunately, this is often not broken down by the amount that goes directly to civil society actors focused on women, but it's a great starting point. And finally, here are a few good global reports. Marcy mentioned the first, which is Women Deliver's report on advancing gender-sensitive localization. But all of these reports have great suggested evidence and solutions tied to this issue. So feel free to draw on them for inspiration, data, solutions. But like Christina said, we know that you'll likely have some great localized data to share as well. So certainly use that too. With that, I will unmute all microphones very soon, and I'd like to open it up to all participants to share your own best practices for advocating for more feminist and localized humanitarian action. We'd love to hear from you about a speech or talk that you've seen on this topic that you thought really resonated well and was successful, and what that looked like, and also some lessons from your own experiences. What are some best practices that you've learned through the years? So I will unmute all microphones, so feel free to raise them out loud. You can also type them into the chat box. I see one raised hand from Poonam. Let me see if you can speak.
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, hi to everybody in the room. This is Dr. Poonam Durdana. I'm from Pakistan, and I'm the CEO and founder of Khudi Research and Development, which is a private firm. And I'm very keen to be in this room today, and it's a great opportunity for me to learn from the experiences of the Women Deliver, and to see how these things for the women rights can be learned in terms of advocacy. In a country like ours, Pakistan, where we have all kinds of dilemma, right from the emergency, right from the insurgency, and right from various humanitarian settings, and now in COVID as well. So my preliminary share in this is the best practice which I experienced myself while doing some of the advocacy work on reproductive health in one of the remote areas. If I have some time to share a very small personal experience through which we were able to implement one of the reproductive health project of UNFPA, where I was the reproductive health coordinator at that time. So we involved religious leaders to provide us with the definite. Hello?
Hi,
Hello.
yes, we still hear you.
Okay, so the religious leaders were involved to give sermons to get the men involved in the family planning and promotion of best gender practices for females at home during humanitarian settings. So this is one of the advocacy tool involvement of the religious leader in our country. And my like what I would like to hear, or I'm keen to learn from this forum, is that what could be the possible opportunities where other CSOs which are working in Pakistan can can join hands, and we be a part of this forum, and where we present our work on a regular basis, and we can also provide data. And since we already have a lot of data on all aspects of reproductive health, right, starting from the gender, family planning, safe motherhood, emergency obstetric care, maternal mortality issues, STIs, HIV, everything. So I would very much want that where we can present this data for research as well, and then in terms of providing some awareness, health education to these communities, doing the capacity building in terms of the health system strengthening, and knowledge management sharing, of course. So this is my small request to get some guidance.
Yeah, thank you, Poonam. I think it's a great question in terms of where and how to find opportunities to speak internationally and share the evidence and expertise. Just one small example, and we'll talk about a few later, is of course the Women Deliver conference that is held every 3 years. It was held last year, so will be coming up very soon again. Is always open. We provide scholarships to advocates from around the world to participate, and is a great opportunity to apply when those scholarships are out to present and to share your expertise. And I know that there are many other organizations offering the same for conferences and other opportunities. So to stay up to date with those. We'll also be sharing just a little bit later some web-based examples for how you can share your expertise virtually, but still to an international audience. I see also that Ruth has a hand raised. If anyone else has a comment to share about some best practices, feel free to raise your hand, and I can call on you as well. So Ruth, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right. I just want to say thank you to Women Delivering for this wonderful opportunity. And I am so very pleased with the updates and putting us on track on what we can expect and how we can improve and how we can meet some of these great opportunities in the near future. But coming to countries like in West Africa, Cameroon, where we come from, our challenges are a bit difficult in terms of meeting the global perspective and also to gain public speaking opportunity. And we don't know, one of the questions I'll be asking is if there is a roadmap of identifying local organizations that can speak publicly, or if not, how is that being managed? And secondly, our organization has been able to implement one big project with iMatch International. We are women with disabilities, and we are trying to do things by ourselves, helping women to gain the skills and be able to engage with other partners, other local partners in their community, and in order to build from there. So that is our platform. And we were able to expatiate our network to all the regions in our English-speaking regions of Cameroon. And we're able to work with the government and also faith-based organizations. And then women with disability for the first time were able to be the command speaker in their region, like calling for other organizations and be able to talk what they can talk and what they want the government and what they want other local organizations to do for them. So that was a really big booster. And we think that if we were able to tell our story and how we are able to manage that, it is going to help other local organizations also and other partners to see the needs to empower young women with disabilities in their own home communities. And looking at this framework, and another point that we think it is really lacking is knowing how much is really allocated to each country or each region, and also particularly to minority groups, because this is a huge challenge that local organizations do face in order to carry on their activities in their area. I'll be ending here, but I wanted to ask if this presentation will be handed over to us, because it's a really, really rich one for us to unpack it. It's not an easy thing. And lastly, talking about the COVID-19, this COVID-19 is not an easy thing, but it seems like we are being paused as far as execution is being carried out. It seems like the minority groups are placed in a pause, and I don't know how women delivery is taking the initiative forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. You raised a lot of great, important points around, data sources and the need for them to be disaggregated not only by gender, but by other considerations, and certainly something that we will all collectively continue to advocate for. To answer your question about the webinar, yes, it will certainly be it is being recorded and will be shared after the presentation. And thank you for the great segue into the conversation around how we can continue this work and continue to support minority and vulnerable groups during COVID-19 through this advocacy, and it's something that we will talk about very soon. I'm conscious of time, and I see that there are several hands raised. I will open it up to Alex, who I see has a hand raised, and others, please do feel free to leave your comments in the chat box, and then hopefully we'll have some more time at the end to unpack this a little further. Alex, over to you.
Hi everyone, hi Marcy, thank you so much for having me. So I'm with the NIA network. Thank you so much for the different speakers. I think that you really highlighted some of the key elements that more generally a lot of local actors are asking themselves, and more specifically women-led organization, women rights organization working on gender issue and feminist issue in particular. There are a number of things that I think resonates a lot with what we have seen in the NIA network, but also what I've seen in other settings. And I just want to mention a few that were partly mentioned, but just to highlight them. One thing that was mentioned is making sure that the invitation, so for example, if invited in global space, being online or being physical, making sure that this is the right space for you. And this is the space where you're going to be able to tell what you need to tell. And I've seen, and we see, and we continue to see so many often invitations that are not really well thought through, where unfortunately there's a lot of tokenism and a lot of checking boxes. We need a local actors, we need a feminist local actor to talk about this, but it's not really thought through. And to be very frank with you, I have refused speaking spots also for our members in certain occasions where I thought that either we didn't have the expertise, or our members didn't have the expertise, or that the one who had the expertise were not available. And that in this sense, it was very important that the people who we would send speaking facilitate speaking would actually be able to talk about the issues they were asked to talk about. And I don't know if this is something you have noticed, but unfortunately it happens far too often. And there are not many organizations like Women Deliver who really curate well their speakers and prepare them and help them to understand the context. And often you are left a bit on your own. And I think that all the tools that have been given are really, really essential, and I make sure that we spread them a lot as well, because they help a lot great preparation. In terms of data, I mean, that's a whole story in itself. But what I noticed is that often, especially local organizations, have their own data, and either based on a project or based on your experience. But then there's often the idea that the data are too small, the community is too small, the project is not relevant enough, and therefore those data are not shared. But I think that here there is a need to be more confident about the fact that it's relevant for the community you come from. And if it's relevant for that community, there is a relevance to share it. And I think that putting it in a broader context, as it was suggested, is very important. But talking about what you have been experiencing individually, but also from a data perspective, it's very powerful. And unfortunately, we don't do it enough. And therefore, we don't give enough credit to feminist and localized humanitarian action. That was the second point I wanted to make. And I wanted to thank you again for organizing and facilitating and making also all those resources and these great experiences in sharing available. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. And I think with that, we had a nice segue into our second part of this presentation. We've talked a little bit already about how to effectively advocate when invited to speak at international convenings. But of course, in light of COVID-19, we know that those travel opportunities are now limited. And for some, like we talked about, it has been difficult to find these opportunities in the first place, even before COVID-19. So we wanted to talk a little bit here about how to adapt our advocacy in this new environment and when travel opportunities simply do not exist. As many of you know, I'll just go through this quickly. A lot of the big international convenings where we would normally use to push for more feminist humanitarian action have been postponed this year, including Beijing Plus 25, several international forums, even the plans for the UN General Assembly this year remain unclear. But that doesn't mean that advocacy for localized and feminist humanitarian action needs to stop. In fact, we know that during this global pandemic, it's important more than ever. In fact, COVID-19 has reinforced, as Ruth has mentioned, the need for more feminist and localized humanitarian aid that meets the need of vulnerable communities and ensures that no one is left behind. We know that girls and women and other vulnerable communities in humanitarian settings face specific, often overlooked challenges to protecting themselves against COVID-19. And we know that local CSOs, like many of you in this call, are often among the best positioned to identify and respond to those needs. And some of you are already doing that work in many settings. It is thus a crucial time, perhaps now more than ever, to call for greater funding and support for local CSOs, including those focused on girls and women, to ensure that our responses are expedient and as effective as they can be. So to that end, we wanted to do an interactive activity to see what this advocacy can look like and come up with some messages together. So here is the situation that we have all been put in this example. You've been invited to give a webinar presentation to talk on behalf of your civil society organizations on the needs of your community during the COVID-19 outbreak. As we have discussed, a lot of global convenings, presentations have moved to webinar form and virtual form in lieu of international conferences. So this is a big way that you'll find opportunities to advocate this year. But according to this webinar agenda, in this example, you are invited to give an opening talk about the impact of COVID-19 on your community, how it's affecting community, and then a quote-unquote expert panel of policymakers and international NGOs will discuss potential solutions. So before we even dive into discussing what the potential speaking remarks and speech could look like we talked about, the advocacy starts before that. So we want to know, how would you reframe this opportunity to the organizers, advocate for yourself to be more meaningfully engaged? Feel free to write your responses in the chat box, or again, if you have a response, just raise your hand. There's a little hand icon on Zoom, and I can call on you to respond. I see Naomi has her hand raised, so over to you, Naomi. Oop, Naomi, I think you're still unmuted on your end. Oh, there you go.
Okay, I'm okay now?
Yep.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Naomi Tude-Sholanki. I'm from Liberia. I run a local organization called Community Healthcare Initiative. I'm also part of the NIA network. I'm part of the Feminist. I'm one of the co-creators of the Feminist Humanitarian network. So now as a local actor, the shift of our conversation, our advocacy has been put on social media or through media or websites. How to really engage this is that there are a few things we need to consider. Like, I have been invited to so many webinars, and I'm going to those webinars, but I take myself out of my privilege and see other women who really want to be part of this webinar, but it requires them to have electricity so they can have their phone charged.
Mm-hmm.
It requires them to have an internet. Some of them don't have access to internet, and if they do, it requires them money so they can be able to participate. Beyond that, there are some that don't have nothing at all, but they are right there place, they have the expertise. How do we get them onto these webinars? How do we get their experience to be shared? Because it was so easy for you to, like, for an organization like Women Deliver to say, okay, Naomi, you are in Liberia, you are invited, we will find your ticket, and it's easy to facilitate me to get me to whatever you want me to speak. Now, you are inviting me to the webinar. Yes. Are you considering that I also need money to get online? So these are the conversations we need to push. Right. How do we equip our local women to be able to engage into the new space that this pandemic has forced us into? Because our work is not stopping. And if our work is not stopping, we are not leaving anyone behind. So how do we assess the needs for everybody, if not everybody, but most importantly, good representation of people to be inclusive into the conversation is key. So it's something that I want Women Deliver and other INGOs that are on this line of donors to consider, that women, local actors want to participate. They have the expertise. They want to bring their lived experience as they are fighting COVID-19, but there are so many barriers that are going to stop them. So if we are putting a webinar, can we identify a group that can say, okay, we're going to support you so you can be able to be online? We have to think of way to support everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Naomi. It's a great point, and I think it's exactly it answers this question so beautifully. That one thing to really advocate and push for, as all of these webinars are being planned, as you're invited to participate, either as a participant or speaker, is really to email organizers and ask what kind of support is available to ensure that you are able to participate. Just like in the previous slides, we talked about advocating for flight support. Visa support. This is a new environment, and when webinars are the main mechanism to speak and get involved in these conversations, it's so important to continue to push for the financial support, the logistical support around internet connectivity, and just pushing for women-focused CSOs to be included in these conversations. I see that Raya also has her hand or his hand raised, so I will go ahead and allow you to speak. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rayat Wollaston. I'm from Ghana. And Naomi and Ruth, I share your sentiments a lot. Right now, what I'm doing here, I run a charity called Gala Foundation.
Oops, I think Raya, you have cut out a little bit. I think it's still cutting out a little bit.
All in Ghana. And
oh, there we go. Oh, I think Raya has cut out a little bit. You can go ahead and write the comment in the chat box, or if you come back, we can call upon you again. I also see a great comment from Carmen about how to reframe this advocacy opportunity. The time allocated will never be enough to convince a meaningful message. It's totally right. And you have to ask what the objective of the webinar is. What are they looking to be accomplished? They're all really important questions to raise. I also see, oh, Ruth, I see you have your hand raised, so I will go ahead and turn the mic over to you.
Oh, really? Anyway, I wanted to hear from Ryan, and the issue of network connection in Africa is also a big blow to our engagement. Am I on?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, the issue of network is also a big blow to our engagement in these big platform and for our stories to be heard, especially with the geopolitical nature of our environment too. It's also causing us a big problem. I relate very well with the last speaker who talks about economic aspect. This also reduces our participation. And I wanted to, because you said something about how our contribution, how we can apply for contribution. But we still understand that when so many people table in hub application for hub, the criteria for them to get into the page is always limited, and local organizations are always left out. So this is a key factor that we don't know how we are going to push that for local organizations, their stories to come up on major platforms. And we will be happy to also have stories about people or women with disabilities who are struggling in countries that are having crises like wars, to come up in major platforms, in order that we should see how donors should focus on how to handle their situation too. So that was another concern that I didn't add. But about this COVID-19, it's still something that we are working on in order to see how we can manage it, because the situation is a big blow, and looking at the economic aspect it's not an easy task for us to really talk about how we are going to push it forward. But I'll be able to listen and learn from what other people put forward in order to carry it from there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. I think that leads us well to the second question in this activity, which is what are the messages that you share? But just before we do that, I just wanted to point out that in addition to advocating for the logistical, financial support that would be necessary to participate in this panel, also you could advocate to change the format of the panel as well. I think it's totally unacceptable that a CSO here is invited to give an opening talk, and then there's a quote-unquote expert panel of international actors that are proposing potential solutions. You should really be involved in the solution crafting and proposals as well. So would also advocate for the civil society representative to be included in that panel. And again, like Carmen had outlined, ensuring that there's more time allocated to do so. And then, like Ruth said, it's important to now discuss what, after we have advocated for you to get there, to have the access you need to participate, for reframing the entire panel so that you can speak effectively about the solutions you'd like to see. What would the message look like? I would just open it up very quickly, maybe a couple sentences from anybody who has their hand raised, or type it in the chat box around what are the messages that you would like to share on why we need a more feminist and localized approach to humanitarian aid for COVID-19. What's the problem and what are the solutions? I see Gina Rose has a hand raised, so I will go ahead and hand over the mic to you. If you could just describe your thoughts on this maybe in a couple sentences so we can get some more reflections as well. Over to you, Gina. Gina, oops. Let's see. Unmuted your microphone, so I think just waiting for you to unmute your own. Okay, if that's not working, feel free to write the response in the chat box. Carmen had mentioned there's so many reasons. Of course, one of the problems and the reason is that there's so many health workers are women, so there's a need to support them. I see Durdana has a hand raised. Let's see if we can allow you to speak. Yep, I've handed over the mic to you, Durdana, so you should be able to unmute your microphone and speak.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again. I would like to add here that if I, like coming from this background of being in Pakistan, this challenges or the problem which we face, it is not only the community itself, it's a double burden of disease. Because COVID at one point and then having the socio-economic factors which are affecting these populations, especially the women and children, it's a nightmare. Like I have been involved in provision of food, other kind of social assistance to these families, and these are like the daily wagers, females who are working as housemaids and now they are at home. Some of them are pregnant, they are living in mud dwellings. I have like footages, I have everything which I'm like developing my database in order to give them some assistance in forms of health education, provision of masks, but yet they are very, very far from the basic necessities or the essentials of life. If I talk of water sanitation, if I talk of clean water, hand washing, like basic things. So relating it to the COVID and then with this other communicable diseases like the expanded program on immunization, like the basic infectious diseases, they are all prone to that. And when it comes to the women and children, we talk of like what I see is that they just lack the basic data. So this is one of the problem which I'm seeing in this part of the world, and it is enormous. I'm just able to cater one very close population here in Islamabad. Whereas I mean whole of the country is filled up with lot of like rural areas are also there. And why it matters is because these women, they are pregnant, these will end up in children having like during COVID-19, likewise they have other maternal illnesses, which of course like emergency obstetric care, like variety of stuff which affects their maternal mortality rate will increase because of it. And the solution which I understand is that in a country like ours, like these are the people who are illiterate. They are not even, they don't have access to internet or those kind of things. So for that matter, like what we are planning is to have these radio messages broadcasted so that they can at least listen to these radio messages or post the pictorials are being pasted on various like their mud houses and all, so that they are able to see it. Like they are illiterate, so for them pictorial and visuals are more important. And like the fourth question, what needs to happen, who needs to what to make the policy change happen? It's in our country, it's the policy maker, but the CSOs, they have a very, very big role because we are able to go to the community. So if we are linked up with the international community, international donors, where we can present this case that here is the community, we can do all kind of interventions with improvised version of all kinds of intervention. So we need support for that. So this is what I would very much like to request this forum that if there are any opportunities, please let us know so we can like even share our experiences. Sharing experiences also, knowledge sharing is the best. And taking this opportunity, I would request that if Women Deliver can develop a knowledge management sharing page where we all who are the participants in this group can keep on adding our experiences. And like it's a country, like it's a global community at the moment, I guess. So it would be really beneficial from where we all can learn and replicate or maybe scale up some things, because who knows, something which is working in Liberia may also work here, because we also have lady health workers, which are the frontline workers, and it is the best practice model of Pakistan, which is exemplified by WHO as well. So we have those females as well, which are working and going to these communities. So we need PPEs for them, and we really don't have it. So there are mix of a thing.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, I think you just gave the perfect speech if you, you know, under this example exercise, highlighting the problem, why it matters, some proposed solutions, and what needs to happen both now. You gave a concrete example of something that Women Deliver could do, which is, you know, knowing your audience and knowing how to advocate, as well as things that can happen in the long term. I think the recommendation about sharing knowledge is a great one. I'm actually going to share in the next slide one of the resources that exist that is led by a coalition known as the Feminist Humanitarian Network that is doing just that. I also see a number of other great example speeches of what could be said in this for this example, including highlighting the problem of gender-based violence and how that doesn't disappear now with COVID-19, and calling on governments and other stakeholders to consider plans for the protection and safety of all. Gina had a great sample speech here again. Sorry, I'm not sure why the microphone wasn't working, but meaningful engagement is also ensuring accessibility to persons with disabilities, including women. And while we are on quarantine during COVID-19, how these issues continue to intensify. Let me just see. Calling on the Commission on Human Rights and Gender Equality and Women's Human Rights to how they're conducting a community to monitor and report these issues, and how TV networks are providing access to information as well. So again, great examples of potential speeches that could be said for these, and we encourage you with your teams to talk through these exercises and develop some talking points on your own as well. Great. So just some more examples of how to reach global audiences with these messages that you've shared and developed now just through the sample exercise in the age of COVID-19. Think about ways to draft and pitch an op-ed with your advocacy messages. This is one great way to share your experiences, the solutions that you need in your community. You could write it usually around 800 to 1,000 words, and have it pitch for it to be placed in a newspaper, either locally, regionally, or internationally. We know the New Humanitarian is one outlet that has been covering globally the scale of the COVID-19 pandemic and the responses of local actors. So could be a potential outlet to target. Also, like we talked before, pitch yourselves to speak on webinars or host your own webinar. Google Plus offers free webinar hosting, and reach out to your donors and international partners to see what support that they can provide around logistics, financial, to ensure that you're able to do so. Somebody talked about social media campaigns to highlight your messages. I think that's a great example of a way you can continue to advocate during this time, using hashtags that are used globally, such as hashtag COVID-19 and hashtag humanitarian for her, to connect to global conversations so that international actors can see your messages. And check in with other coalitions you're part of to see how you can contribute to their perspectives to global advocacy. I had mentioned we know that many of you may be members of the Feminist Humanitarian Network, or if you're not, there's the email right there, and they have been compiling on their website exactly what was mentioned previously, kind of a knowledge management platform to share different ways that local grassroots actors, including those focused on or led by women, have been responding to COVID-19 in their communities and the solutions they need. So it's a great way to share your experience, your knowledge, and your perspectives, and have your own report included on that website. with that, I'm just conscious of time, so I will hand it over to see if there's any questions. And at the same time, I'm going to open up the post test. Just to complete the same questions that we ran through at the beginning. And at the same time, if you have any questions, please do raise your hand and we can talk through them together. We are at time, so if you do have any questions, as long as you feel comfortable staying for a few extra minutes, we can certainly address them. So the post test has been launched for those that are using Zoom, and I'll also share it for those that are not using for whom it's not coming up on the web browser, so that you can click it. So I'll just share it in the chat box in just a sec. There we go. Okay, I see a couple of hands raised. So Alex, I will turn it over to you.
Oh, I think my hand was still my hand. Sorry,
Oh,
I
okay.
forgot to download it.
No
so
worries.
Let's have other people who have not spoken first.
Sure. Okay, I see a few responses to the post test coming up, so continue to respond to that. I see Oyen Lola. Go ahead, the mic is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. My question really is based on gathering data, especially in the country. I'm from Nigeria, and it is getting data about um, gender-based violence, especially I mean, even without the pandemic going on, getting data on the amount of violence women face in Nigeria is very difficult. Then added now to this pandemic going on, my question now is, in a case where it's very difficult to gather data in a country like ours, what's the next best thing to do to be able to pass our advocacy forward, to be able to make sure our voices are still heard, even without as much data, without data that we can't get because of how very difficult it is to get women to come forward and how very suppressive the regime is. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think around, when access to data does not exist around the kind of data you want, what are the best ways to advocate? I'm going to turn it over to any panelists to see if anybody, Christina, Diana, or Marcy, if that is a question that you'd like to take or is relevant to something you've seen in the past.
Oh, hi, sorry, this is Christina. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Great. So I think one of the things that we've noticed works is often there are researchers and academic institutions in national universities that are doing data collection. And so it's also connecting with them. And then in addition, from our perspective, and I think someone else mentioned this, it doesn't have to be, data for the whole country or even a whole, state within a country. It can be local, like much more localized data based on a project that can then just be used as indicative of broader trends and patterns. And I think, of course, everything needs to be collected in an ethical, gender-sensitive way. But I think that it doesn't have to be the big stat, the big data stat. It can just be focused on a very small area, even a neighborhood within a city. It's helpful as representative of broader trends and patterns. So I think that's just what I would share, is that it doesn't have to be the same equivalent of national statistics. Local data is just as meaningful, and I think personally more meaningful often, because especially if it's sourced from NGOs who are actually on the ground doing that collection.
Great, thank you, Christina. I see one user with a question. I think it has actually as your username the computer name because it says Huai. But if that is you, I am handing over the mic to make your comment or ask your question. Okay, we'll give it a few seconds. I'll turn it back to Gina. Let's see if it works this time. Oh, Gina. Let's see, Gina, are you able to speak? Okay, I see some great contributions in the chat box as well. From Paula, one of the challenges that I also see as a humanitarian is to include the visions, beliefs of feminism that exists in these contexts, not just a homogenous voice around feminism. I think it's really necessary to include these messages, demands, and point of view of different feminisms. For example, in indigenous countries in Latin America, Caribbean, in Arab states, etc. Yes, I think that's a great point. And I think it's one that we don't hear enough in international advocacy, and that local actors are really best positioned to do. So that is all from us. I wanted to thank you so much again for participating in this webinar. Of course, we know that these conversations are ongoing and will continue both within your organizations and beyond. So we hope that you can use this webinar deck as a resource to talk amongst your own communities, your own organizations around crafting messages and crafting your advocacy plan during this uncertain time. Thank you all for the incredible work that you do, and we look forward to connecting another time. Thank you.